So I thank Mr. Puhar Gandhi and Professor Tirunavukarasu, who referred me to him, but he's not here today, I think, for the invitation to address the Dravidian Professionals Forum. As I have conducted research and written about the Dravidian parties, and this forum has Dravidian in its title, I thought it would be appropriate for me to discuss some ways in which the Dravidian parties influenced Tamil society and democracy. In the process, I will address the influence of these parties over reservation policies, the panel's topic, and how far they promoted social mobility among disadvantaged groups. Over the past few years, we crossed many landmarks associated with the history of the Dravidian parties. The centenary of the Justice Party was in 2017. The self-respect movement will have its centenary in 4 years if we date it to have begun when Kudiyarasu began publication. The DMK's 70th anniversary occurred in 2019, and the AIADMK's 50th anniversary will be next year. Also, the assembly elections due in less than 4 months will be the first since the state's dominant political leaders of the past 3 decades, Jayalalitha and Karunanidhi, died. Major social movements and political parties have a reciprocal relationship with ongoing social change. Social changes influence political forces, which in turn affect society. Some changes that I will attribute to the Dravidian parties, to express myself more simply, also shaped the way these parties developed. The Dravidian parties have ruled Tamil Nadu continuously for nearly 54 years, except during periods of president's rule. And they have dominated electoral politics since the AIADMK was formed. They have polled between 55.3% and 72.3% of the vote in assembly elections since then. Aside from dominating electoral politics, they deepen democracy in various ways. They increased voter participation, which has been higher in Tamil Nadu since the DMK's rapid growth in the 1960s than in most other states. Voter participation has been comparably high only in Kerala, Punjab, Haryana, and West Bengal. Participation increased among middle and lower status groups somewhat earlier in Tamil Nadu than in most of India. Also, the DMK and the AIADMK gave these groups greater political representation and benefits. Crucially, they made educational and job reservations for the middle and lower castes and Adivasis as high as 69%, higher than in most other states. These reservations are higher only in Lakshadweep, where they are 100%, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Nagaland, and Mizoram, where they are 80%, and Chhattisgarh, where they are 72%. They were briefly higher in Maharashtra at 75% from 2018 until the High Court reduced the quota for the so-called socially and educationally backward classes in June 2019. And the Supreme Court stayed this quota in September 2020. The figures I just quoted don't include the 10% quota that the central government extended to economically weaker sections, independent of caste, in 2019. The noon meal scheme, whose success inspired its adoption in other states, and a similar, though less effective national program, particularly improved nutrition, health, and education among the poorest. Along with high government educational investments and SC/ST scholarships, it significantly increased primary school enrollment to the 3rd highest level in India. High investments in primary health, the wide distribution of subsidized food grains, homestead land and housing, a rural employment program that was successful until Jayalalitha's death, and the proliferation of women's self-help groups extensively benefited the underprivileged. Moreover, the Dravidian parties, and especially the DMK, built social and political links across religious lines and thereby limited the growth of Hindu nationalism and restricted intolerance and violence toward the religious minorities. Tamil Nadu has been among the weakest states for Hindu nationalist parties, which in state assembly elections polled at most 3.2% of the vote in 2001, and only between 1.8% and 2.9% in all other elections since 1991, and between 3.7% and 5.5% in parliamentary elections through the 2010s. The BJP has grown more over the past decade or two in various other states where it was historically weak, such as Kerala, Orissa, West Bengal, Assam, Manipur, Tripura, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Nagaland, and Mizoram. It remains comparably weak, or about as weak as in Tamil Nadu, only in the regions of Andhra Pradesh that did not become part of Telangana, where the BJP polled only 0.8% to 2.2% in the assembly elections of the 2010s, and 1.0% in the last parliamentary elections. So Hindu nationalism is very weak in Tamil Nadu. Its weakness here was crucially because DMK leaders promoted norms contrary to those that the Hindutvavadis value. Tamil specificity based in middle caste cultures, rather than Hindu and Indian homogeneity based on Sanskritic upper caste norms. And because, except when it was allied with the BJP from 1999 to 2004, the DMK built cooperative links between OBC Hindus, Muslims, and to some extent, OBC Christians. Such networks impeded Hindutva growth and interreligious violence, both of which were most limited in the DMK strongholds in northern and central Tamil Nadu. So this is the positive side of the story. And there is a significant, there are significant positive dimensions to the effect that Dravidianism and the Dravidian parties had on Tamil society and democracy. However, there were definite limits to how far the Dravidian parties deepened democracy and built tolerance. Dalits and many OBCs of lower status had limited representation in their leadership and enjoyed little autonomy in them. Periyar placed Dalits and non-Hindus on the Dravidian community's margins and resisted reservation for Dalits soon after independence, when he felt this constrained the prospects of the middle class. His organizations opposed untouchability practices, but it did not prioritize ending them. Close links with certain big landlords made the DK reluctant to oppose agrarian bondage, which limited the lives of most Dalits. The DMK was most closely associated with the middle class, and so did not impede middle caste violence towards Dalits much. In the Kaveri Delta, it initially built middle caste Dalit alliances, the upward mobility of some of whose members it enabled through minor land reforms. In its northern bases, it gained some support among Dalits, but less than among other groups. Where it was weaker until the 1970s, in the southern and western plains and the Vaihe and Tamarabarni deltas, it forged links with the most politically assertive castes, the Mukulator and the Konguvela Alagaunde, and therefore did not oppose their periodic anti-Dalit violence. This was, for instance, the case with the violence centered around Mudugulattur in 1958, elsewhere in the southern plains since the 1990s, and in parts of the western plains since the 2000s. Moreover, once entrenched in power, the DMK and the AIADMK became more closely aligned with dominant castes and classes everywhere, and party activists led caste violence at times. For instance, in Viluppuram in 1978, Pulliyur in 1998, Shankarilingapuram in 2001, and Nayakangote in 2012. Tamil Nadu's educational and job reservations benefited OBCs more extensively than Dalits and Adivasis. Congress introduced an OBC quota of 25% in 1951, which the DMK raised to 31% in 1971, and the AIADMK to 50% in 1980. Less widely noted is the entitlement to OBC reservations under Dravidianist rule of a further 27% of the population, including better off castes such as the Konguvelalar, that were the predominant beneficiaries thereafter. This creamy layer became equally thick only in Maharashtra, and that only briefly when the Marathas were roughly comparable to the Konguvelalar, were allocated 16% from 2018 to 2019, and 12% in education and 13% in jobs from 2019 to 2020. By comparison with how they increased OBC quotas, the Dravidian parties raised the SC/ST quota by less than a fifth. They doubled the OBC quota and raised the SC/ST quota, the more disadvantaged groups, by less than a fifth, from 16% to 19%. Below these groups reported population's share of 21%, which is itself an underestimate because it does not include the increasing number of Christian SCs. The OBC job quotas are filled more than the SC/ST quotas, especially in higher posts. However, the introduction of a 1% tier for the STs in 1989 and a 3% tier within the SC quota for the Arundhatiyer in 2009, as well as the adoption of a special component plan directed to Dalits, helped some of the lower status groups. Similarly, the two 10% tiers created within the OBC quota in 1989 for the MBCs and the denotified communities helped less advantaged OBCs. Thus, caste-targeted policies primarily benefited better off middle castes, but also offered Dalits, Adivasis, and worse off OBCs the slimmer pickings. Moreover, the Dravidian parties distributed productive assets mainly to the upwardly mobile, rather than to the poorest and to Dalits and Adivasis. This was particularly noticeable in land ownership and tenurial reform, which primarily aided middling tenant farmers, largely drawn from the middle class, whose secure tenure helped them buy land. The generous subsidies for agrarian inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, and water pumps, and extensive availability of agrarian credit and loan waivers further enable such mobility. Only a small section of SCs and STs benefited thereby. Although Dalits and Adivasis remain predominantly rural and agricultural, their presence remains negligible among middling and larger landowners. This is one more way in which the Dravidian century was no Dalit Adivasi millennium. Thus, the DMK and the AIADMK enabled the mobility of some lower middle and middling strata and adopted somewhat egalitarian welfare policies that especially helped the poorest, including many Dalits. Along with sustained attention to language identity, these policies gained the Dravidian parties more widespread and durable support than managed by other caste-focused parties, such as the socialist, middle caste, and Dalit parties of northern and western India, and language-based parties, such as the Telugu Desam and the AGP. They contain challenges to class and caste inequality without major property redistribution. Now, how far might society and politics change in Tamil Nadu after Jayalalitha's and Karunanidhi's demise? The Dravidian parties ceased to be the main forces mobilizing society from the late 1980s, although they remained electorally dominant. Civil society mobilization has pressed significantly beyond Dravidian social visions, a trend that is likely to accentuate. Many caste associations pressed to change caste policies, and various other associations oppose certain neoliberal policies. Some of these civil society initiatives led to the emergence of new parties that mobilized certain MBCs, such as the PMK among the Vaniyar, OBCs, such as the Kongu Nadu Munnetra Kazhagam among the Kongu Velalar, and Dalit castes, the Vidudhilai Sirthaigal Katchi, primarily among the Parayar, Pudhiya Tamizhagam, primarily among the Pallar, and Adi Tamizhar Peravai among the Arundhatiya. But these parties polled no more than 8.1% of the vote, although the groups they claim to represent are a much larger share of the population, and they influenced their aspirations much more than their vote share suggests. Other newer parties, notably the DMDK, gained support across group boundaries, but they did not poll over 8.4% of the vote, and DMDK only got 2.4% in 2016. These developments suggest that the Dravidian parties retain more electoral support than influence in civil society. Even continuity in electoral support is uncertain for the Dravidian parties. The AIADMK support, which depended crucially on charisma under both MGR's and Jayalalitha's leadership, is less sustainable than the DMK's, as no credible successor has emerged to Jayalalitha. By contrast, the DMK's support depended mainly on rhetoric and practices emphasizing language, caste, and a popular community, rather than its leaders' perceived qualities. Moreover, Kalaignar grooms Stalin as his successor over 3 decades. This makes the DMK's prospects much brighter than the AIADMK's over the coming decade. This is confirmed by the DMK's strong performance and the AIADMK's decline in the 2019 parliamentary elections and the assembly by-elections held since Jayalalitha's death. The DMK-led United Progressive Alliance won 38 of the state's 39 seats and polled 54.4% of the vote, 54.4% of the vote in the parliamentary elections, in contrast with the AIADMK-led National Democratic Alliance's tally of merely 1 seat and 19.4% of the vote. In the assembly by-elections held since Jayalalitha's demise, the DMK won 13 seats, the AIADMK 9, and the Amma Makkal Munnetra Kazhagam 1, which is the more significant because the AIADMK was the incumbent in 22 of these 23 constituencies, in everything except Karunanidhi's constituency. The AIADMK's recent electoral and political decline creates room for the growth of more multi-caste and caste parties and movements. So I'll stop with that. And once again, I thank the organizers for inviting me, and for the rest of you for listening to my